Aaron had a way of making every room feel smaller. Not because he was loud or overbearing, though he could be both when he wanted, but because when he was near, I couldn't look anywhere else. We'd been best friends since high school, inseparable in that easy, careless way boys can be when they haven't learned yet what distance is supposed to mean. He was the guy everyone liked. Charming without trying, confident without arrogance, always the first to joke, the last to take things too seriously. Straight, by every definition. And then there was me. I was quieter, more cautious, the one who thought twice before speaking. I'd always kept my feelings close, especially the kind you couldn't say out loud. Which meant that by the time I realized I was watching Aaron too closely, too often, I already knew it was something I couldn't confess. The first time he stayed the night at my apartment, it was nothing unusual. He sprawled on my couch, kicked his shoes off, and made himself at home like he always did. "Your Wi-Fi actually works," he said with a grin, tossing his backpack against the wall. "Mine's useless." It was harmless, just another night. But when midnight rolled past and the movie credits faded, he stretched and said, "I'll crash here, if that's cool." Cool. Sure. Except my couch was barely big enough for one person, let alone a 6-foot guy who slept like he was fighting off invisible enemies. So, without thinking too hard, I offered my bed. "You can take it. I'll grab the couch." He laughed, shaking his head. "Don't be dramatic. We'll share." Not like it's the first time. And maybe it wasn't, we'd fallen asleep side by side on road trips, intense on friends' floors. Back then, it had been simple. But lying beside him that night, both of us older now, stretched across the same mattress, it didn't feel simple anymore. The room was quiet except for the hum of the city outside. His breathing evened out quickly, like he had no reason to be uneasy. I, on the other hand, lay frozen, hyper-aware of every inch between us, and of how little there actually was. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was just Aaron being Aaron, casual, comfortable, unbothered by closeness. He'd drape an arm around me during movies, shove his face into my shoulder when he laughed too hard, rest his head on me during long car rides. For him, it was natural. For me, it was survival, holding myself together while wishing it meant more. But that night was different. Because when I finally turned my head, needing just one more look at him, I found him already looking at me. There was no smirk, no teasing comment. Just his eyes, steady in the dark, like he'd been waiting for me to notice. I felt it in my chest first, the ache of recognition, the dangerous thought that maybe I wasn't alone in this. His gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, and then, just as quickly, he blinked and rolled onto his back. Neither of us said a word. By morning, the moment had dissolved into routine again. He stretched, yawned, and raided my fridge like nothing had happened. And I let him, laughing at his terrible attempt to cook eggs, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. Because when he left later that day, slinging his backpack over one shoulder, he paused at the door. "Hey," he said, casual as ever. "Same time in 2 weeks?" I froze. "What?" He shrugged. "You know. Another night here. Every other week. Kind of like a tradition." Tradition. That's what he called it. But his grin faltered just enough to make me wonder if he felt the weight of it too. And as the door clicked shut behind him, I realized this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was the start of something I couldn't name, something that would pull me in deeper every time he walked through that door. The way he looked at me that night, it wasn't nothing. And deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, he showed up at my door like nothing had changed. Backpack slung over his shoulder, hair messy from the wind, that same grin that always seemed to disarm me. "Movie night?" Aaron asked, stepping inside before I could answer. It was easier to play along than to question why my stomach twisted at the sight of him. So I nodded, pretending his visits weren't already the most predictable part of my life. He claimed the couch was useless, and without discussion, we ended up stretched across my bed again. The TV glowed in the dark, some action movie we'd both seen 100 times. I didn't watch it. Not really. My focus drifted to the rise and fall of his chest, the curve of his arm where it rested against mine, the casualness with which he filled the space between us. Halfway through the film, he tugged his hoodie off and tossed it to the floor. The thin t-shirt underneath clung to him, outlining muscles I'd spent too long trying not to notice. My throat went dry. I told myself it was harmless. Friends sat this close all the time. But when his knee brushed mine under the blanket, he didn't move it away. And neither did I. The room felt smaller. My pulse hammered. Every shift of his body seemed magnified, the twitch of his fingers, the way his breath touched my skin. At one point, his hand landed on the blanket between us, palm up, fingers loose. If I reached out, I could touch him. I didn't. But the possibility hung there, dangerous and magnetic, until I had to sit back against the headboard just to keep from giving in. He noticed. Of course he did. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Just comfortable." He smirked, as if he didn't believe me, and turned back to the screen. But he shifted too, inching closer until his shoulder pressed into mine again. It was the kind of casual move no one else would think twice about. But for me it was a spark, quiet but undeniable. Later, when the credits rolled and silence filled the room, he yawned and rolled onto his side. His face was suddenly inches from mine, the kind of closeness that makes your breath shallow, like the air's been stolen. "You're not gonna kick me out of bed, are you?" he teased, eyes half-lidded with sleep. I tried to laugh, but my voice cracked. "Not tonight." He grinned, satisfied, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing evened out. I stared at him in the dark, every nerve in my body alive with the awareness that this was not nothing. It couldn't be. Because no matter how many times I told myself it was just friendship, just comfort, just Aaron being Aaron, my heart knew better. My heart knew I was waiting for something he hadn't said yet. And I couldn't help but wonder if, deep down, he was waiting too. By the third night, silence had become its own kind of language between us. It wasn't the kind that pushed people apart. No, this silence had weight, like every unspoken word pressed into the mattress between us, daring one of us to break it. Aaron sprawled beside me, his arm tucked under his head, watching the shadows on the ceiling. We'd run out of things to say hours ago, but neither of us reached for sleep. I could feel his body heat radiating across the small gap between us, taunting me with the knowledge of how easy it would be to close it. Then, in the dark, his voice cut through softly. "You ever think about how weird this is?" The question landed sharp in my chest. My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he muttered, still staring up. "Just how we always end up here. Same bed. Every other week." I forced a laugh, aiming for lightness. "Guess you're just addicted to my cooking and working Wi-Fi." But he didn't laugh. He turned his head toward me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "That's not what I mean." I couldn't breathe. "Then what do you mean?" He hesitated, his lips parting like the words almost made it out, but then he shook his head and looked away. "Forget it." The silence returned, heavier now. My pulse pounded, and I wished more than anything that I could ask the questions clawing at me. "Do you feel it too? Do you stay here for the same reason I let you?" But I stayed still. Safe. Cowardly. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, Aaron whispered, "It doesn't feel weird, though. Not with you." I turned toward him, my chest tightening with something dangerous and hopeful. He was close enough that I could see the outline of his jaw, the faint curve of his mouth. I wanted to reach for him, to press into the warmth I knew he wouldn't pull away from, not tonight, maybe not ever. But I didn't move. Because if I did, if I gave in to the gravity pulling me toward him, it would change everything. Instead, I just lay there, memorizing the weight of those words. Not with you. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, humming with possibilities neither of us could name. And when his breathing finally slowed into sleep, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing we had crossed an invisible line. Something had shifted. Something that wouldn't shift back. It had been a brutal week. Assignments piling up, long shifts at work, and a headache that clung to me like fog. By Friday night, I was running on fumes. When Aaron knocked on my door, I almost told him to go home. But then he held up a bag of takeout like an offering. "Thought you could use this," he said, smiling in that easy way that made saying no impossible. We ate in silence. Not the heavy kind this time, but the tired, comfortable kind. When we finally stretched out on the bed, I let myself sink back into the mattress with a sigh I couldn't hold in. "You look like hell," he teased. "Thanks," I muttered, closing my eyes. For a while we lay there in quiet. Then I felt it. His hand pressing lightly against my back. At first I thought it was an accident, but it didn't move. Just stayed there, steady and warm through the fabric of my shirt. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a hug or anything anyone else would notice. But it was him, touching me, not in playfulness or clumsiness, but in something gentler. And it undid me. I didn't cry, not really, but my throat tightened, and my chest ached in a way that felt dangerously close. When I finally turned my head, he was already watching me. His eyes weren't teasing this time. They were soft, steady, almost searching. "You'll be fine," he said quietly, like it was the most certain thing in the world. I nodded, afraid my voice would betray me. His hand moved slowly from my back to my shoulder, his thumb grazing my collarbone. The touch was small, nothing more than a pause, but it stayed. Longer than it should have. The air between us shifted. I leaned into it without meaning to, my body betraying everything I'd tried to hide. For one dizzy moment, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. Then he pulled back. Quickly. Too quickly. His hand dropped, and his gaze flicked away as if he hadn't realized what he was doing. My chest felt hollow. I wanted to grab his hand, to place it back where it had been, to tell him I needed it there. But I stayed still, letting him retreat into the safety of pretending nothing had happened. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. He shifted onto his side, back toward me, as though the wall between us was easier than whatever had almost passed through. But I didn't sleep. Because no matter how much he tried to brush it off, I knew. I knew what I felt in that moment when his hand lingered too long. And I knew he had felt it too. It wasn't nothing. Not anymore. By the fifth night, the weight of what we weren't saying had grown unbearable. I'd told myself I could keep it contained, that whatever I felt could stay tucked away, harmless, as long as I never gave it breath. But the more nights we shared, the more impossible it became. His closeness wasn't harmless anymore. It was consuming. That evening, we lay side by side again, the room lit only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. He was quiet, more than usual, his arm draped across his stomach, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I thought he'd fallen asleep until his voice cut the stillness. "It doesn't feel like nothing." My heart stopped. I turned my head slowly, afraid the moment would vanish if I moved too fast. "What doesn't?" "This," he said simply, his voice low but steady. "Us. Whatever this is." The words hung between us like a match sparking in the dark. My throat was dry, but I forced myself to answer. "What if it is something?" His eyes flicked to mine. For the first time, he didn't look away. The silence stretched, trembling under its own weight, before he let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. "Then I don't know what that means," he admitted. His voice cracked on the last word, unguarded in a way I'd never heard before. I swallowed hard. The ache in my chest was unbearable, but I pressed into it. "Maybe it doesn't have to mean anything right now." He shifted closer, until the space between us was nothing but air. Our foreheads brushed, tentative, fragile. My breath caught, every nerve in my body alight. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But it was enough to make my heart stutter, to make me realize I wasn't imagining this. He was here, too, caught in the same storm, terrified and drawn to it all the same. His eyes closed briefly, like the touch itself was too much to hold. "This isn't me," he whispered, almost to himself. "I've never—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "But with you, it doesn't feel wrong." I wanted to tell him I understood, that I'd spent years convincing myself to bury the way I looked at him, that every time he reached for me without thinking, it both healed and tore me apart. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I let the silence carry what I couldn't say, our foreheads still pressed together, my hand hovering near his but not yet daring to touch. Because I knew if I did, if I closed that last inch, nothing would ever be the same. And yet, as the quiet deepened around us, I realized nothing was the same already. We had crossed a line we couldn't go back from. After that night, the air between us changed. It wasn't heavy anymore, not the way it had been when every silence threatened to break me. Now, the quiet felt softer, charged but safe, like we'd both agreed, without saying it, not to run. Aaron was still Aaron, teasing me when I overthought things, stealing food off my plate, acting like my apartment was an extension of his own. But there was a difference in the way he lingered now. His hand would brush mine and stay a second longer than before. His hugs lasted just a breath too long. He didn't flinch from the nearness anymore. If anything, he sought it out. One night, we sat cross-legged on the bed, an old video game console hooked up to the TV. He beat me 3 rounds in a row, then smirked when I tossed the controller down. "You're just mad I'm better at everything," he teased. "Better at losing your balance, maybe," I shot back. He lunged, tackling me sideways into the mattress. We laughed, breathless, as we wrestled half-heartedly. But then the laughter died, and suddenly he was hovering over me, his hand pressed against my chest, his face inches from mine. The world shrank to the sound of our breathing. His eyes searched mine, something fragile flickering there, before he leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't careful, not exactly, but it wasn't rushed either. Just a soft press of lips, brief and uncertain, like he was testing the ground before stepping onto it. My heart surged. When he pulled back, his expression was unreadable at first, then broke into the smallest smile. Guess I didn't know I was waiting. Neither did I. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. He lay down beside me, his hand finding mine in the space between us, and we stayed like that, silent, steady, holding something unnamed but undeniable. The conflict that had gnawed at me for weeks didn't vanish, but it shifted. For the first time, I wasn't alone in it. He was here too, caught in the same confusion, and for tonight that was enough. I didn't need labels. I didn't need answers. I just needed this, him, beside me, no longer running. And when I closed my eyes, I knew we had already stepped into something real, whether either of us was ready to say it or not. The morning after, I expected regret. That was the rhythm I'd been bracing myself for, closeness at night, distance by daylight. I thought Aaron would wake, realize what he'd done, and find some excuse to vanish back into the world where everything was simple. But when the sun cut through the blinds, painting light across the sheets, I turned and found him still there, arm draped heavy over my waist, his breath warm against my neck. He didn't move when I shifted, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, his grip tightened slightly, like even in sleep he was afraid I might slip away. And for once, I let myself stay. When he finally stirred, blinking himself awake, I watched the moment his gaze found me. He froze, then smiled, small, cautious, but real. "Morning," he whispered. It was such an ordinary word, but it landed in me like something dangerous. "Morning," I echoed, my voice rough. Neither of us mentioned the kiss. Neither of us named it. But neither of us pulled away, and that, I realized, was the point. Later, in the kitchen, he sat at the counter while I made coffee. His hair was a mess, his shirt wrinkled, but he didn't care. He just watched me like I was suddenly something worth studying. You're quiet, I said, trying to fill the space. He smirked. You finally noticed? I rolled my eyes, but the tension between us had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was electric. He took the mug I handed him, fingers brushing mine deliberately this time. You know, he said, his voice casual but his eyes locked on me, we're not good at pretending. My throat tightened. Pretending what? That this is nothing. The words hit like a stone in still water, rippling through every corner of me. I set my mug down, steadying myself. Aaron, I'm not saying I've figured it out, he interrupted quickly, as if afraid I'd pull away. I'm not saying I have the right words, but I know what it feels like. With you. I searched his face. He wasn't smirking now, wasn't teasing. He was bare in a way I'd never seen him, open, uncertain, but choosing not to hide. And in that moment, the conflict that had haunted me, the push and pull, the silence, the fear of crossing the line, quieted. Not gone, but different, because he was standing in it with me. I don't want to pretend either, I said finally, my voice softer than I meant it to be. Something eased in him, like he'd been holding his breath. He smiled, not small this time but wide, boyish, unguarded. The kind of smile I knew he didn't give to just anyone. He reached across the counter, covering my hand with his. So, we'll figure it out? I nodded. Yeah. We'll figure it out. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise of forever. But it was enough. That night, when he climbed into my bed again, it wasn't by accident, wasn't under the guise of needing comfort or a place to crash. He came to me knowing what it meant, and I made room for him without question. As the lights dimmed and his hand found mine in the dark, I realized the story between us wasn't about a single moment, not the first night he stayed, not the first kiss, not even this one. It was about every silence that had carried weight, every touch that had lingered, every unspoken truth that had finally found its voice. Whatever this was, messy, uncertain, unnamed, it was ours. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next.